Good evening. Thanks for joining us on India Business Hour. I'm Shireen Bhan. A quick check of the equity market action. Markets falling for the second straight day today. The Nifty gave up on 11,800. The Sensex slipped below 39,500. Both those indices ended 0.5% lower. The mid-caps and the banks fell in line with the benchmarks. However, for the week, the Nifty and the Sensex ended 0.5% higher, marking the first weekly gain this month. That's the market snapshot for you. But shares of debt-ridden Dewan Housing have been under pressure in trade. The company has deferred its fourth quarter earnings to the end of July, citing, and I quote, unforeseen operational engagements and also due to the non-availability of a few directors. The company is facing a liquidity crisis, as we know, and recently defaulted on repayment obligations. The company's promoter, Kapil Vadhavan, told CNBC-TV18 earlier this month that they are looking to sell assets to repay the dues. But we learned from sources that banks are now looking to initiate resolution process for DHFL under the RBI's new stressed asset resolution framework. Ritu joins us now with more. So Ritu, how soon can we expect banks to move on the resolution process under the June 7th circular?
The fact that DHFL is facing a liquidity crisis is of course publicly known, with the company defaulting on its NCD and commercial paper dues. Now we're given to understand from sources that banks are considering initiating a resolution plan for DHFL under the new stressed asset resolution circular or the 7th June RBI circular. Now we understand that banks are mulling several routes for restructuring, including conversion of debt into equity under the circular. Another option, of course, is to take over some of DHFL's assets under the direct assignment norms of the RBI, which will allow banks to take charge of DHFL's assets and also reduce their own exposure to the lender. But first of all of the bankers would have to sign the Inter-Creditor Agreement, or the ICA, under which any resolution plan can be executed. And it's only after that that the next steps can be taken. Now, do remember, DHFL has a total debt of over 1 lakh crores on its books, which includes almost 40,000 crores of bank loans, where SBI, with over 8,800 crores of exposure, is the lead banker.
Ritu Singh, many thanks for that. SBI Chief Rajneesh Kumar has also spoken on the DHFL resolution issue, speaking to journalists after a meeting with the Financial Services Secretary in the capital. The SBI Chief said, and I quote, any stressed asset, NBFC or otherwise, will be covered under the June 7th RBI circular, end of quote. Well, there's a barrage of economic data to report today, so let me take you through that one by one. Exports in FY19 hitting the highest ever mark of $337 billion. That's a 9% rise compared to last year. But imports have also seen a significant jump of over 10%, crossing the $500 billion mark. This effectively sent the trade deficit higher by $20 billion compared to last year. The current account deficit in FY19 jumped by nearly $10 billion to 2.1% of GDP. FDI inflows in FY19 have seen a marginal increase of about $400 million. But the government has already hit 52% of its full-year fiscal deficit for this financial year in just the first 2 months of April and May. Government spending has also risen in the first 2 months. Tax receipts are also higher by nearly 20,000 crores. Well, that's a snapshot of the macroeconomic data. On to a CNBC-TV18 exclusive. The government may consider offloading its entire stake in Air India. Sources say the centre is finalising a fresh disinvestment plan for the airline, and the preliminary information memorandum is likely to be floated soon. Anu Sharma joins us with the details. Anu, so the government giving it another shot, and this time deciding, or likely to decide, to go all the way.
Sources have told us that the government officials are currently formulating the draft of preliminary information memorandum for divestment of Air India, and the new Air India specific alternative mechanism, which was a panel set up by the Cabinet Committee in May 2017 for the process, is likely to hold a meeting very soon to approve this draft so that this memorandum can then be floated next month. Now, the expectation is that the government is looking at divesting its entire stake, 99 to 100% stake in Air India this time, which is very different from what it did last year. Remember, last time the government invited bids for 74% stake in Air India, and while a lot of parties did show interest in buying that stake, but ultimately no one submitted the bids, and the larger reason that was cited by a lot of companies and a lot of interested parties was that they were not comfortable in a joint venture with the government. So this time the government has tried to change the norms. This alternative mechanism which was basically the panel on Air India, is likely to hold a meeting very soon. And remember, the divestment of Air India is part of Modi government's 100-day agenda, so they want to kickstart the process as soon as possible. Also, we're given to understand that internal calculations of the airline show that around 2021, over 90% of the employees at Air India are likely to retire, which would basically leave around 1,000 to 1,500 employees that the government is working on how to take care of them as part of the divestment process. And operationally speaking, 19 planes that were grounded at Air India are likely to get activated by September. So that is another attempt at making the airline more attractive to the bidder who wants to buy. Back to you.
I think Air India would signal a very positive intent in terms of the overall economic reforms. I think last time, they got broadly the first phase correct. I thought there would be more changes made to terms of reference. And those critical points where, first of all, you need a clean state divestment, you need 100% divestment. So I think what you will see this time is almost 100% stake. Second is that there is a considerable amount of working capital debt. So the stage two, the second part of this would be to ensure that the working capital debt is put in an SPV, and you give a debt-free company.
This time there will be a different mindset for the airline to be sold out. I think the government has seen two aviation deals fall through. It's not just the Air India divestment plan that fell through the last time around. They've also had the experience of going through the Jet Airways shutdown over the past few months. So that should give them a wiser worldview to be able to restructure the airline in a way where it will be more palatable for investors from India or abroad.
Well, Air India up for sale once again, and this time the government deciding to go all the way. Now, quick look at some of the other headlines that we're tracking tonight. Jet Airways employees and London-based investor Adi Group have come together to bid for 75% of the airline. They plan to explore the revival of Jet Airways through the NCLT route as the airline is facing bankruptcy proceedings currently. The Bimal Jalan panel on RBI's economic capital framework will meet again on the 17th of July. Former RBI Deputy Governor Rakesh Mohan, who's also a member of the panel, confirmed this and maintained that this is likely to be the last meeting. Top finance ministry officials are working on the government's short, mid and long-term agenda for the financial sector. Sources say these officials will soon submit plans for the first 100 days of Modi 2.0 and for 2022. They will also share a 5-year roadmap with proposals that are implementable. The RBI has allowed asset reconstruction companies to buy assets from its peers. However, the central bank has maintained that selling entity must use the proceeds to redeem underlying security receipts within 8 years of the transaction. Furthermore, the transaction must be settled in cash. Well, the G20 summit is kicked off in Osaka in Japan with leaders of the world's fastest growing economies coming together. The points of friction prominently are the trade spat between China and the US, the consequent impact on 5G technology, especially on Chinese player Huawei, and the divergence in stance on an issue like climate change between US and Europe. At the summit, G20 leaders urged US President Donald Trump and China's Xi Jinping to reach a deal on trade or risk the global economy. India, Japan and US also held a trilateral meeting on the sidelines of the summit where they discussed improving connectivity and infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region, with Prime Minister Modi highlighting the importance of India to the grouping. At an informal BRICS meeting on the sidelines of the summit, Prime Minister Modi made a pitch for a global coalition against terror, calling it the biggest threat to humanity. Chinese President Xi Jinping, meanwhile, said that BRICS nations had to set up policy coordination, with BRICS entering its second decade now. But it's been a busy day for our Prime Minister in Osaka. Having arrived in Japan on Thursday, Prime Minister Modi has held meetings with Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He's also had pull-asides with other world leaders on day one of the summit, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and South Korea's Moon Jae-in. But it's important to note that the Prime Minister's meeting with the US President Donald Trump less than 24 hours after tweeting complaints against India's trade policy, Donald Trump's tone was more conciliatory. Today, in fact, he began the proceedings by congratulating the Prime Minister on his election victory. Optics suggest the meeting went well. Both leaders have made a pitch for a mutually beneficial cooperation on 5G, and they were seen together at the table over dinner as well. Well, to take the discussion forward, we are now joined by Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the US, Anjali Prasad, India's representative to the World Trade Organization, and Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador to the World Trade Organization. Meera Shankar, Anjali Prasad and Jayant Dasgupta, appreciate you joining us here on the program. There is a great degree of emphasis, especially from the US side, on 5G, making it clear, reiterating that yet again. And this is going to be a balancing act for India, because the Chinese have made it clear that India must make an unbiased choice. And of course, we have our own security concerns, as Jayant Dasgupta was pointing out. But, you know, ahead of the 5G trials, how do you see this playing out? And what would your view be on the position that India should take?
I think India would need to keep its long-term security interests in mind, and balance those against costs and technology and the speed with which adoption can take place. The US has also been warning its allies like the UK that they are not confident that even with the kind of testing systems that the UK was thinking of to have partial Huawei equipment, that their communications would be secure. And therefore, they might not be in a position to share intelligence and information with the UK as they have been accustomed to, because they would be worried about it being compromised. So I don't think that a decision has been taken there yet. And for India, we would have similar concerns about security in the long run. The choices we make are going to determine also our communication wavelength. Since we have a lot of defense equipment from the US, I think there could be issues if we have Huawei as the 5G communicator. But I think it's premature. I don't think any decision has been made as yet by the Indian government.
It's been taken, yes.
On free trade, the US really had no stomach for a free trade deal with India. When I was there, they didn't want it mentioned at all. And when we suggested that, okay, without commitment, the governments could commission a study by an institute, a non-governmental institute like the Peterson Institute with Fred Bergsten, and that to examine the pros and cons, what would be the benefits and the downsides for both countries, so that the countries could take an informed view later, and the study would be without commitment.
Sure.
Even that was not acceptable to the US at that stage, because they were in a protectionist move. So when I think President Trump talks about a deal, he's talking about a deal on the issues that have come on the table from both sides. Market access, intellectual property, data protection or data localization, stents, and from the Indian side, H1B, GSP and so on. So he talks, when he talks of a deal, I think he's talking of somehow finding a package of give and take which resolves these issues.
Okay, a package, not a deal as necessarily was being discussed previously, whether it was a BIT or a free trade agreement. But Anjali Prasad, on the issue of data localization as well as data flow, because this was a matter that was not just discussed between India and the US, but at the G20 in general as well. Now, the Foreign Secretary seemed to make it clear that the WTO perhaps would be the appropriate forum to put together global rules on the movement of data so that the interests of developing countries like India are also kept in mind. Do you believe that that perhaps is the best way forward?
As we had discussed yesterday, in all these discussions, there is an intersection between the multilateral and the bilateral. Now, what we are discussing in the context of the US at the moment on e-commerce are two things. One is e-retailing and the other is data localization, because those particular companies are affected at the moment. So, however, we are also in the midst of discussions on the entire gamut of issues on e-commerce in the multilateral forum. So, as the Foreign Secretary said, we would rather resolve these issues in the multilateral forum, although we have not yet consented to negotiating rules on e-commerce in the WTO.
Yeah.
So, therefore,
right.
We would have to, at the moment, have some bilateral discussions, as Ambassador Meera Shankar said, as part of this package.
Yeah.
And as the government has already had a discussion with the e-retailing players on their issues, they have also sought comments from the fintech companies on the data localization issues. So we need to wait and watch on where this might go.
Absolutely, and two more meetings are scheduled with the Commerce Minister and stakeholders on the policy for e-commerce, e-tailing, as well as data localization, as Ms. Prasad pointed out. But Chand Dasgupta, just to take that forward, you know, there's a long list of asks and expectations that the US has from India. Tariffs, non-tariff barriers, data localization, e-commerce, and so on and so forth. What should India's key asks be in return?
I think in each of these sectors where the US has made a demand, there are defensive interests that India has, and there are offensive interests as well in some of these sectors. And that is where India needs to, of course, raise the ante and ask. As far as e-retailing is concerned, for instance, a lot of hullabaloo was raised by two very large e-marketplace platforms which are controlled from the US. Now, as the latest figures show, in terms of consumer electronics, in terms of mobile phones, and in terms of apparel and fashion items, their market share has in fact gone up since 31st of January, when the new e-marketplace guidelines came into force. So I think the US's demands on the e-marketplace restrictions that have been placed, or the new guidelines that have been put in place, they are somewhat misplaced.
Ambassador Shankar, you know, since you spoke about the fact that the US is approaching this as sort of putting together a package, and that is what President Trump seemed to be hinting at, what would you expect now in terms of next steps, the mechanism that the US and India will need to sort of put together to ensure that we can see past some of the differences and thrash out a package?
I think they have a trade policy forum where the USTR, US Trade Representative, and the Commerce Minister from our side, you know, are the heads. And there's also a separate forum where the Commerce Secretary from the US side and our Commerce Minister are the head. But I think it would also be important for India to engage with the business associations in the United States, and also clearly, you know, try to work out where it has some give and where it doesn't have give, to be able to say that clearly, and also establish cross linkages. For instance, if we buy defense equipment, you know, it's sometimes just a decision taken by Ministry of Defense, but the Commerce Ministry should know in advance, so they are able to say, we would buy this provided X, Y, Z. They should be very explicit in the linkages that they establish. So instead of working in silos, we need a whole of government approach to handling these issues so that they can be resolved.
I think that's a very important point that you make, that India will need to explicitly state the cross-linkages, especially since we intend to deepen the defense partnership between the two countries. But Anjali Prasad, let me ask you, ma'am, for closing comments now. In terms of the next steps, we heard there from Ambassador Shankar on presenting a holistic picture, negotiating not in silos but as a whole. What would your apprehensions, key apprehensions be as we move forward?
My apprehensions coincide with what Jayant Dasgupta said, that the US is basically trying to give a go-by to the requirements and the imperatives of developing countries like India, and trying to negotiate deals which it refers to as fair and reciprocal, whereas we must emphasize that we would like to resolve all these major issues within the framework of the rule-based, equitable multilateral trading system. If you see, there was this very interesting statement which came out of the Russia-India-China trilateral, which said exactly this,
right.
That the primacy of the multilateral trading system needs to be maintained, and any WTO reform has to be informed by the requirements of developing countries and LDCs. So we need to move forward, keeping this central point in mind, that both economies are highly asymmetrical, and we cannot possibly have what is called a reciprocal kind of deal.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is what President Trump keeps harping on, that reciprocity and a fair deal is what he wants. Jayant Dasgupta, in the context of the fact that, you know, the president is up for re-election and he is going to have to address a large domestic constituency to address the concerns that Anjali Prasad said, that, you know, on the issue of reciprocity, President Trump has made it amply clear it's his way or the highway. So how do you really see progress on some of these contentious issues, given the fact that he's going to be addressing his domestic constituency as well?
I agree entirely with what Anjali and Ambassador Meera Shankar have mentioned. We can't really, throw our own national interests overboard in order to keep the U.S. happy, or at least the U.S. president happy. Because his view of reciprocity is that if India is exporting motorcycles to the US at near zero duties, then Harley-Davidson motorcycles should come to India also at zero duties. Now, that is just the kind of reciprocity that the US has in mind. And there are complementarities, of course, but India is not at the same level as the US. It has a per capita income which is 1/25th that of the US. So there are huge issues about development, about industries, about human resources. So we can't have reciprocity. In fact, that is one of the cornerstones of the WTO, that there should be less than full reciprocity as far as the developing countries are concerned. So unless the president appreciates this and respects it, and very importantly, since the US has just lost a case against India in the WTO yesterday, which will perhaps irk the US administration even more now. The thing is that the US has to be somehow coaxed, cajoled, and persuaded to come back to the WTO and negotiate there, rather than indulging in, putting pressure on the bilateral front and then trying to get things done.
Well, I hope that is not an exercise in futility, because so far that certainly seems to have been the case as far as the US is concerned. No amount of coaxing, cajoling or persuasion has got President Trump to see merit in a multilateral world. He doesn't believe in it. Ambassador Shankar, Anjali Prasad and Jayant Dasgupta, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18 to make sense of the big headlines coming in from the G20 meeting and the bilateral between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi.